In the dim, trembling light of dawn, the plantation seemed like a sleeping beast, silent on the outside, but full of secrets that writhed beneath its skin. Cypress trees dripped with moss like mourning veils. The air carried the scent of wood smoke and sorrow, and the house itself sat perched at the top of the hill like a witness that refused to speak. But behind those whitewashed walls, beneath the polite whispers of Southern society, and hidden under the weight of 1,000 unspoken truths, a love existed that should never have lived long enough to breathe. It began in the kitchen, the one place where heat and hunger mixed, where pots simmered with spices that carried memories from faraway lands, and where the enslaved cook, Elias, moved with quiet grace. He worked like a man who had long since accepted his chains but refused to let them take his soul. His hands, rough and skilled, crafted meals that even the mistress could not describe without her voice softening. And though she never said it aloud, every flavor he created stirred something inside her that had nothing to do with hunger. Her name was Eleanor, the plantation wife, elegant, lonely, trapped in a marriage colder than the marble floors beneath her feet. Her husband, Master Thorne, was a man shaped by cruelty and polished by power. To society he was dignified. To his slaves he was merciless. To Eleanor he was a ghost, present but empty. She lived in the same house as him, slept in the same bed, dined at the same table, yet felt farther from him than from the strangers who passed through town on horseback. It was in this emptiness that her eyes began to linger, first on the meals Elias served, then on the hands that prepared them, and finally, on the man himself. She noticed the way he hummed quietly while chopping herbs, the way his shoulders carried strength without arrogance, and the way his eyes held stories he'd never been allowed to speak. Elias noticed her too, not as the mistress, not as the woman who held power over his life, but as someone who was just as trapped as he was. Their chains were different, but the weight was the same. For weeks, nothing happened. Nothing except the subtle shift of glances and heartbeats, the kind of dangerous silence that grows heavy with meaning. Until one night, when Eleanor wandered into the kitchen long after the house had gone still. She claimed she could not sleep. Elias claimed he did not hear her approach, but the truth was simpler. They had both run out of excuses. That night their hands brushed, when he passed her a cup of warm tea. A simple touch, a simple spark, but in a world built on rules sharper than razors, even a spark could burn a whole plantation down. No one knew then that death was already walking toward them. No one could guess that this fragile, forbidden love, born quietly in the shadows of the kitchen, would unravel the plantation's order, expose every hidden cruelty, and provoke a rage so violent it would echo through the generations. Their love did not begin with passion. It began with hunger, the hunger for kindness, for freedom, for someone who finally saw them. But on the plantations of the American South, hunger was dangerous. It made people rebel. It made people desperate. It made people willing to risk everything. And someone noticed. A jealous maid, a watchful overseer, a suspicious husband, a creaking floorboard in the wrong moment, a whisper carried through the night. The exact trigger would forever remain uncertain, but the consequences were not. By the time the truth reached Master Thorne's ears, it was too late. Elias and Eleanor had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, and the South had rules, merciless, unforgiving rules, about people who forgot their place. This is the story of a love that defied society, a secret that bloomed where it had no right to grow, and a death that sealed the fate of everyone who lived on Thorne Plantation. A story buried in shame, resurrected through letters and testimonies, and remembered only because tragedy carved its name into the soil, and it all began in the kitchen, with a forbidden touch that cost them everything. Loneliness is a strange, suffocating thing. It does not arrive loudly like anger, or strike suddenly like fear. Instead, it creeps, soft, invisible, patient, until it fills every corner of a person's soul. For Eleanor Thorne, mistress of the Grand Thorne Plantation, loneliness had become a second skin. It moved with her, slept with her, ate with her, and whispered to her in the long, echoing corridors of her home. Her days were measured not in hours, but in silences. Her husband, Master Thorne, was a man whose presence chilled a room faster than winter wind. He spoke only when necessary, touched her only when it benefited his image, and regarded her more as a trophy than a wife. Their marriage, celebrated by Charleston society as a perfect union, was nothing more than a well-kept lie, Behind closed doors, they lived like strangers bound by a contract neither had the courage nor freedom to break. It was in this emotional wasteland that Eleanor first noticed the slave cook, Elias. He had always been there, quiet, disciplined, and skilled beyond measure. He moved through the kitchen like a poet, not a worker, precise hands, controlled movements, and an odd gentleness in a world built on brutality. While other slaves avoided eye contact in fear of punishment, Elias held his gaze steady in a way that unsettled Eleanor at first. Not arrogant, not defiant, just present. It was something she hadn't felt from any man in years. Their connection did not begin with words. It began with observation. Eleanor often wandered into the kitchen under the pretense of supervising meals, though no supervision was needed. The truth was simpler. The kitchen was the only room in the entire mansion that felt alive. It smelled of spices, warmth, and something she couldn't name, something that reminded her she was still human. Elias rarely spoke unless spoken to, but he listened. Really listened. It was a foreign sensation for Eleanor, who had spent years speaking to walls and receiving silence in return. At first, she asked him small questions about recipes, ingredients, why he used certain herbs instead of others. He answered with quiet confidence, his voice steady and low, like a lullaby shaped into words. Each conversation was a stolen breath of peace. For Eleanor, the household was a battlefield of gossip, expectation, and judgment. The kitchen, however, was an island, and on that island stood Elias, the only warmth she had known in a life built around cold appearances. One evening, she lingered longer than usual, watching him knead dough with strong, practiced hands. His sleeves were rolled to his elbows, revealing arms marked with scars that told stories he could never safely share. She found herself wondering, not for the first time, what kind of pain could carve such lines on a man's body yet fail to dim the light in his eyes. "Does it hurt?" she asked impulsively, surprising herself. Elias looked up, pausing. "Pain is pain, ma'am," he said softly. "Some of it heals, some of it don't." Her breath caught, not from the words but from the honesty in them. In a world where everyone lied beautifully, Elias spoke plainly. It was disarming. Their forbidden connection grew slowly, shaped by silent moments. She began noticing things she had never paid attention to before, the way he hummed softly while stirring a pot, the way his eyes softened when he smiled at the younger slaves, the tension in his shoulders when Master Thorne entered the room. These small details, harmless on their own, became dangerous when stitched together by a lonely heart. Eleanor felt herself drawn to the kitchen more frequently. She found excuses, checking dinner, kneading tea, inspecting supplies, each lie thinner than the last. Elias pretended not to notice, but the slight smile he fought back told her that he did. One rainy afternoon, lightning cracking across the sky, Eleanor sought refuge downstairs. The storm outside felt like a reflection of the one brewing within her own chest. Elias was preparing bread, the room warm and fragrant, his presence grounding. "Are you afraid of storms?" he asked without turning. "No," she whispered. "I'm afraid of everything else." That was the first time she confessed something real. Elias didn't respond with pity or questions. He simply said, "Then you're stronger than you think." The word struck her harder than thunder. A bond formed, dangerous, unspoken, but real. Not built on attraction, though that existed, but on understanding. Elias saw her pain, not her status, and for the first time in years, Eleanor felt seen. But loneliness, when fed, often becomes hunger, and hunger is far harder to control. Their touches began innocently, brushing hands while exchanging dishes, fingertips meeting over a recipe book, the moment too long to be accidental. Every touch left Eleanor trembling, though she hid it behind forced composure. One night changed everything. The mansion slept. The halls were dark. Eleanor found herself again in the kitchen doorway, unable to sleep, compelled by something she no longer wanted to resist. Elias stood alone, wiping down the tables. He looked up when she entered, not startled, but knowing. "You're awake late again, ma'am," he said quietly. "I couldn't rest," she answered. Silence stretched between them, thick, charged, forbidden. When their fingers brushed that night, they did not pull away. That single touch, soft yet full of lightning, shattered every rule written by society, her marriage, and the plantation itself. It was the beginning of a love that should never have existed, a connection that brought warmth to her life. And, at the same time, began a countdown toward tragedy. Because on plantations, love was the most dangerous rebellion of all. The second keynote marks the moment when everything shifted, subtle, quiet, nearly invisible to anyone who might have passed by the plantation house that humid summer night. But inside the kitchen, behind the half-open door, something irreversible unfolded, something that would bind the plantation wife and her slave cook in a secret that neither reason nor fear could undo. This was not the night they first spoke, nor the night they first felt a pull toward one another. It was the night the boundary between longing and surrender dissolved, slowly, dangerously, inevitably. The plantation kitchen was always hot, even after sunset. The stone hearth still glowed with embers, and the lingering scent of corn cakes clung to the air. The slave cook, Elias, stayed behind to clean the iron pots, wiping them with slow, deliberate motions, trying to stretch the final quiet hour of the day. For him, the kitchen was more than a workspace. It was the one place where he had a sliver of freedom, the freedom to think, to breathe, to imagine something outside the brutal routines of plantation life. What he did not expect that night was the soft rustle of a silk gown behind him. The plantation wife, Mrs. Annabel Harrow, stood at the threshold. She never came this late. Her visits were always timed, civilized, proper, checking recipes, discussing meals, observing his work. But tonight, she lingered without speaking. Her face was pale from the heat, or perhaps from something deeper. Elias straightened instantly, his posture respectful, his gaze lowered. He had been taught from childhood that looking directly at a white woman, especially the mistress, could cost him his life. But tonight, she stepped closer. "I couldn't sleep," she said, her voice trembling, not from fear, but from the weight of a truth she didn't know how to hold. "The house feels suffocating." Elias simply nodded, unsure what she needed from him. She took another step, then paused, glancing back toward the hallway as if expecting someone to emerge from the shadows. No one did. The kitchen door behind her remained slightly open, the warm night air drifting in. It was symbolic, though neither of them realized it yet. A door left open is an invitation, even if unspoken. Her eyes finally met his. It lasted only a moment, but in that moment, Elias saw exhaustion, loneliness, and a hunger for human connection that had nothing to do with food. She had married into wealth, into status, into a name that promised comfort. But it had given her none of the things that mattered: affection, companionship, tenderness. Her husband was a man of reputation, not heart. The marriage bed had long been cold, and the servants whispered about how often Mr. Harrow visited the quarters for his own twisted pleasures. Annabel's heart, unknowingly, had begun to drift toward the only person who had ever shown her sincerity, a man who lived in chains but held more warmth than her free husband ever had. When she spoke again, her voice was softer. "Elias, may I sit?" He hesitated. A white woman sitting in the kitchen late at night, alone with a slave. This was unheard of, dangerous, reckless. But refusing her was equally impossible. He gestured politely to the wooden stool near the hearth. She sat, smoothing her dress, her fingers trembling. For several long breaths, neither of them spoke. The silence grew heavy, thick with everything unsaid. Finally, she whispered, "Do you ever wish life were different?" The question was like a blade, sharp, forbidden. Elias felt his pulse thunder in his ears. Slaves were not allowed to dream, at least not publicly, but she didn't look at him like a mistress waiting for obedience. She looked like a woman begging for truth. "Yes," he said carefully, "every day." The simplicity of the answer undid her. She leaned forward, tears glistening at the edge of her eyes. "I do too." Those 4 words became the bridge between them. Annabel talked, slowly at first, then freely. She spoke of her loveless marriage, her isolation, the cruelty she witnessed on the plantation but was powerless to stop. Her words poured out like water from a cracked vessel, and Elias listened, not because she was the mistress, but because he saw the human beneath the silk. When she finally fell silent, he placed a clean cloth on the table, his hand brushing hers for the briefest moment. It was accidental, but it was enough. Her breath caught. His hand froze. The air thickened. In another world, in another life, they might have moved away. But isolation and desperation make their own rules. Annabel's fingers curled, ever so gently, around his. And though Elias wanted to pull away, every instinct warned him of the consequences. Her touch was a plea he could not ignore. For the first time in her marriage, someone held her hand with genuine tenderness. The kitchen door remained open, the night wind brushing Annabel's neck like a whisper of warning. But she ignored it. She leaned closer, her forehead nearly touching his. "You are the only person who sees me," she breathed. "And you are the only person who speaks to me like I'm a man," he replied softly. That was the breaking point. What happened next was not planned, not rational. It was the collision of two souls starved of affection, crushed under the weight of oppression, hers social, his physical. Their lips met in a stolen moment that felt both sinful and sacred. The kiss was gentle at first, hesitant, then desperate. Years of longing condensed into a single breath. When it ended, they both stared at each other, terrified by what they had just unleashed. "This cannot happen again," Annabel whispered. But they both knew it would. Because something had awakened that night. Something stronger than fear, more dangerous than desire, and more destructive than either of them could foresee. The final thing she did before leaving the kitchen was the smallest detail of all. She did not close the door behind her, and a door left open, once, will never fully shut again. The third keynote marks the beginning of suspicion, an invisible shift that neither Annabel nor Elias noticed until it was far too late. Forbidden affection can remain hidden for a while, but it always leaves traces, a lingering look, a misplaced item, a moment of silence too heavy for its own good. And on a plantation where power rested in the hands of a man who ruled his household with ruthless entitlement, even the smallest change became a threat. Annabel thought she had hidden her emotions well. After the night she left the kitchen door open, she tried to return to her daily routines, hosting guests, managing house staff, attending to her duties as a plantation wife. But inside, she was shaken. Something within her had awakened, and although she tried to bury it under propriety and fear, her eyes told a different story. They carried a softness, a brightness, a sense of life that had been missing for years. Her husband, Mr. Harrow, was not a man of sentiment. He wasn't attentive to his wife's feelings, nor did he care much for her happiness, but he was possessive. He monitored her behavior the same way he monitored the plantation's accounts, coldly, methodically, and always with suspicion. For men like him, control was oxygen, and the slightest deviation from order set him on edge. So when Annabel began spending more time in the kitchen, something she had rarely done before, he noticed. At first, he dismissed it as boredom or idle curiosity, but then he realized she visited at odd hours, late evenings, early mornings, moments when she should have been in her room or attending to social obligations. He also noticed small changes in her demeanor. Her smiles were softer, her eyes seemed distant. When he spoke to her, she flinched, not out of fear but out of distraction, as if her mind were somewhere else entirely. That was what unsettled him most. A wife could be obedient, silent, fearful, but she was never supposed to be distracted. One evening, Mr. Harrow returned home earlier than expected. His boots were muddy from riding through the tobacco fields, and he entered the house without announcing himself. He heard voices, soft ones, coming from the back hallway that led to the kitchen. His wife's voice, and another, a man's voice. He froze. He recognized the tone before he recognized the words. Annabel was speaking gently, the way she once had when they were newly married, before resentment filled their home like smoke. But she wasn't speaking to him. By the time he reached the hallway, the voices had stopped. Annabel stepped out alone, smoothing her dress, her cheeks flushed. Elias had already slipped through the side pantry door, heart pounding. He had heard the creak of boots long before Annabel did, and instinct had saved him from being caught. But instinct could not erase Harrow's rising suspicion. That night, at the dinner table, Harrow watched his wife closely. Annabel kept her gaze down, eating slowly, unaware of the scrutiny burning into her. Harrow asked no questions, but he didn't have to. His silence was the kind that strangled. Even the servants felt it. After dinner, he summoned the head housemaid. "Has my wife been spending time downstairs?" he asked, swirling his whiskey absent-mindedly. The maid hesitated, but only for a moment. Harrow's temper was well known. "Yes, sir. More than usual." That small confirmation was enough to spark something ugly inside him. The next morning, Harrow walked to the kitchen unannounced. Elias was preparing breakfast, his hands steady though his nerves throbbed beneath his skin. Harrow stood there longer than necessary, watching him. Elias did not make eye contact. "A fine cook," Harrow muttered. "Some say too fine." Elias didn't speak. Silence was his armor. Harrow took a slow step closer. "I hear my wife praises your work quite a lot." The implication hung in the air like a noose. Elias said nothing. He had survived this long by mastering the art of silence. But Harrow was not a man satisfied with quiet. He liked fear. He watched Elias's face for the slightest flicker of emotion, guilt, panic, anything. But Elias remained still. It only made Harrow more suspicious. Instead of confronting Annabelle immediately, he chose a different tactic. He observed, watched, tested. He began changing his schedule without warning, appearing in doorways unexpectedly, walking through the house at odd times of day. He listened behind walls. He questioned servants. He watched Annabelle with the intensity of a hunter stalking prey. And she felt it. Days passed, and Annabelle's nerves grew brittle. Every creak of the floorboards made her jump. Every shadow in the hallway made her heart race. She tried to avoid the kitchen, but that was impossible. Her longing for Elias was stronger than her fear. Their exchanges became brief, stolen seconds in passing. A brush of fingers when handing over a dish. A shared glance that lasted too long. But Harrow saw everything. The turning point came when Annabelle, distracted and exhausted, accidentally left her hand resting on the kitchen table after passing Elias a bowl. Harrow, who had entered moments earlier without them noticing, saw the gesture, saw the warmth in her eyes, the softness in her posture, the way Elias subtly stepped back to maintain distance. It was enough. That night, Harrow lay awake beside his wife, staring at the ceiling while she slept fitfully. He wasn't thinking about love or betrayal. He was thinking about ownership, his wife, his household, his slaves, his reputation. All of it was his, and someone had dared to touch what he controlled. The suspicion that had once been a whisper was now a roar. A storm was building, quiet, invisible, but deadly, and although Annabelle and Elias could not yet see it forming, they felt the air thickening, the ground shifting, the sense that something terrible was coming. Keynote 3 marks the moment when danger entered the story, not through violence or confrontation, but through the growing awareness of a man whose pride was more lethal than any weapon on his plantation. And once suspicion takes root in a mind like Harrow's, it never stops until it destroys everything in its path. The fourth keynote marks the moment when secrecy failed. Not because Annabelle and Elias were careless, but because tension and fear create cracks in even the strongest walls. It was the first real mistake, small enough to seem harmless at the time, but large enough for Mr. Harrow to seize, as confirmation of everything he had begun to suspect. This was the moment when danger stopped being distant and became a living thing, breathing, waiting, watching. It began on a sweltering afternoon. Annabelle had spent the morning pretending everything was normal. She hosted a neighbor for tea, spoke quietly about weather and harvests, and smiled just enough to hide the tremor in her hands. But the moment the visitor left, her mask crumbled. She rushed to the kitchen under the excuse of giving new instructions for dinner, her pulse racing. Elias was alone, kneading dough on the wooden table. Flour clung to his arms, sweat glistened on his brow, and though he did not look up when Annabelle entered, he felt the shift in the air. He sensed her before he heard her. "You shouldn't be here," he said quietly. "I know," she whispered, stepping closer, "but I needed to see you." Her voice carried desperation, not desire. The pressure of Harrow's growing suspicion had pressed itself into every corner of her mind. She felt watched, hunted. The walls of the house felt like they were closing in. Elias saw the fear in her eyes instantly. "Has he said something?" Elias asked. "No," she said, shaking her head. "But he knows. I can feel it." Her voice shook. Elias stepped closer, not touching her but standing near enough that she could feel his presence. For a moment, the world outside the kitchen disappeared. It was just the two of them, breathing in the same quiet space, leaning on one another even without touching. And that was the mistake. Neither of them heard the footsteps. A young serving boy, Jacob, only 13, walked into the kitchen through the back door with a basket of herbs. He froze at the sight of them standing so close, Annabelle's face inches from Elias's chest, their bodies turned toward one another in a way that was unmistakably intimate. Annabelle gasped and stepped back so fast she nearly stumbled. Elias turned away, grabbing a knife and pretending to chop onions as if nothing unusual had happened. But the boy had seen enough. Jacob tried to look away, tried to seem unaware, but fear flashed in his eyes. He knew what such a sight could mean. Not just for Elias, for himself as well. On plantations, silence was survival, but secrets were also currency. And children, especially enslaved children, learned early how to navigate that dangerous balance. Annabelle forced a smile. "Thank you for the herbs, Jacob. You may go." The boy nodded stiffly, placed the basket on the table and hurried out. Annabelle's heart pounded. "He's just a child," she whispered. "He's a child who wants to live," Elias answered grimly. They both understood. The boy wouldn't intentionally betray them, but fear makes people talk in ways they don't mean to. And plantation owners listened too closely. By that evening, the mistake had already begun unraveling everything. Jacob didn't run to Harrow directly, he didn't dare, but he avoided looking at Annabelle during dinner. When Harrow asked casually if any deliveries came today, Jacob stuttered. When Harrow asked if he went to the kitchen, Jacob froze. That was enough. Harrow's instincts sharpened like a blade. The boy wasn't lying. He was afraid. Afraid of what? Harrow wondered as he studied him. Dinner ended. Annabelle excused herself early, her nerves raw. Harrow watched her leave. Then, slowly, he leaned forward and placed his napkin on the table. "Jacob," he said softly. The boy swallowed hard. Harrow didn't yell, he didn't threaten. That wasn't his way. Instead, he spoke with deceptive gentleness, a softness far more terrifying than rage. "Tell me," Harrow said. "What did you see today?" Jacob's lips trembled. Nothing, sir." Harrow tilted his head. "Nothing?" "Yes, sir. But children can't hide fear from a man who thrives on it." "Jacob," Harrow said, his voice dropping to a whisper, "a lie can get a man killed. Truth keeps the world in order. Which one are you choosing right now?" Jacob broke. He didn't name Elias. He didn't name Annabelle. But he said the one thing Harrow needed to hear. They were close. Just one word. Close. It detonated everything. Harrow's eyes sharpened, his jaw clenched, and his fingers drummed slowly on the table. He said nothing else to Jacob. He dismissed him with a flick of his hand, and sat in silence long after the boy left, staring at the polished wood in front of him. Everything he had suspected had just been confirmed. That night was the first time Annabelle felt real danger in the house. Harrow's silence was heavy, poisonous. When he joined her in the bedroom, he did not speak, did not touch her, did not even look at her. He just sat on the edge of the bed, elbows on his knees, breathing slowly like a man working to control something violent inside him. Annabelle lay rigid, knowing he knew, but not knowing how much. Across the house, Elias couldn't sleep. Every crack of the wood, every gust of wind outside, every rustle made him sit up, expecting the door to fly open and Harrow to come for him. The mistake had been small, a moment too close, a child walking in at the wrong time, but on a plantation ruled by cruelty and jealousy, small mistakes ignite disasters. Keynote 4 marks the first slip. The moment a single witness turned a secret into suspicion, and suspicion turned into something darker. The storm was no longer approaching. It had already arrived. Keynote 5 is where suspicion turns into action, cold, calculated, and meant to break someone without leaving visible marks. Mr. Harrow had his confirmation. He didn't have the full truth, not yet, but he had enough: a trembling servant boy, a frightened wife, a cook who suddenly avoided eye contact. And when a man like Harrow believes he's being made a fool, he doesn't confront. He tests, he hunts, he watches until his prey reveals itself. This chapter marks the moment when Harrow decided to set a trap, one designed to drag the truth out of hiding and to make both Annabelle and Elias suffer before the truth even surfaced. For 2 days after Jacob's slip, Harrow acted as though nothing was wrong. He spoke gently to his wife. He complimented her dress. He asked about her health, her rest, her routines. The kindness was so unnatural that it felt like a threat wrapped in velvet. Annabelle responded cautiously, smiling when he smiled, nodding when he spoke, her heartbeat drumming loud enough that she feared he could hear it. But Harrow was not watching her husband to wife. He was watching her predator to prey. Every movement she made, every breath, every hesitation was measured. When she avoided the kitchen, he noticed. When she jumped at sudden sounds, he noticed. When she spoke too softly or smiled too quickly, he noticed. Inside Annabelle, a terror grew, a feeling like standing on a trapdoor without knowing when it would give way. Meanwhile, Harrow turned his attention to Elias. The test began quietly. Harrow ordered Elias to bring his breakfast to the main dining room, a task normally assigned to the younger servants. Elias obeyed without question, carrying the tray with careful, steady hands. Harrow didn't acknowledge him at first. He flipped through a newspaper, let Elias set the table, arrange the cutlery, pour the tea. When Elias turned to leave, Harrow finally spoke. "Stay," one word, sharp as a blade. Elias froze. Harrow sipped his tea slowly, watching Elias with narrow eyes. "You do good work," he said. "My wife thinks so too." Elias didn't react. Couldn't. It was a statement sharpened with suspicion, weighted with accusation. "I'd like you to serve dinner for the next few evenings." A command, not a request. This was the trap. Plantation wives rarely interacted with male slaves during meals, never directly. If Elias served dinner, he and Annabelle would be forced into the same space under Harrow's gaze, with every move analyzed for signs of guilt. Elias bowed his head. "Yes, sir." Harrow smiled, thin, cruel. "Good." The first night of the test was excruciating. Annabelle nearly fainted when she saw Elias carrying the serving dishes. Harrow sat tall at the head of the table, elbows rested on the carved arms of his chair, eyes fixed on both of them with chilling stillness. Every step Elias took felt like walking through a field of knives. Every time Annabelle reached for a dish, she kept her eyes on her plate. Every breath felt dangerous. Harrow asked Annabelle about her day. He asked Elias about the food preparation. He made comments about loyalty, discipline, temptation, and those who forget their place. Each word was aimed like a stone thrown at glass. Annabelle trembled. Elias kept his face expressionless. Harrow watched both cracks form. The second night, Harrow escalated the test. He asked Elias to refill Annabelle's wine glass, 3 times in 20 minutes. He asked Annabelle to compliment the food. She forced out shaky praise, knowing Elias could hear the fear in her voice. Harrow listened to every note of it like a man listening for a confession. Then Harrow made his move. He dropped his knife deliberately, let it clatter to the floor, and said calmly, "Elias, pick that up." It was a test of subservience, a test of fear, but more importantly, a test of reaction. Elias obeyed. As he knelt to pick up the knife, Harrow looked directly at Annabelle. Her face paled, a tiny, involuntary flinch. Harrow saw it. She tried to mask it immediately, but it was too late. Harrow leaned back slowly, a smile touching the corner of his mouth, not a pleasant smile, but the smile of a man who had just confirmed his darkest suspicion. That was the moment the truth was revealed, not spoken, but seen. Annabelle's fear was the confession. Elias's silence was the confession. And the tension between them was louder than words. Harrow now knew, not the details, not the extent, but he knew enough. The third night, Harrow unleashed the final part of his test, and this time, it was cruel in a way meant to break both of them. He dismissed the other servants from the dining room, claiming he wanted a quieter evening. Only Elias stayed. Only Annabelle sat across from Harrow, trembling silently. Halfway through the meal, Harrow placed his fork down and folded his hands. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice calm, "about loyalty, about betrayal, about what can happen under my roof without my knowledge." Annabelle froze. Elias did not move a muscle. Harrow continued, "Sometimes people forget their place. Sometimes people think they can reach above their station." He paused. "And sometimes a wife forgets who she belongs to." Annabelle's breath caught. Harrow turned to Elias. "What do you think, boy? Should a man punish someone who lies under his own roof?" Elias felt the trap closing around him. He answered quietly, "I think it's not my place to say, sir." Harrow smirked. "Good answer, smart answer." Then with deliberate cruelty he said, "Because some men need to be reminded of their place, and some women need to be taught their duty." Annabelle nearly broke down. Elias felt something inside him snap, not fear but a growing certainty that violence was coming. Harrow rose slowly, his chair scraping the floor. The test was over, the truth was confirmed. and now punishment would follow. Keynote 5 is the turning point where suspicion becomes cruelty, where Harrow transforms from a manipulative observer into an active threat. This is the moment the story shifts from secret danger to imminent violence. The trap has been set, it has been sprung, and now everything is about to unravel. Trust is a strange thing on a plantation, especially in a place where every smile is watched, every step is calculated, and every whispered word can tear through families like a blade through cloth. When the truth about the plantation wife's forbidden affection for her slave cook began to seep through the cracks, the household entered a quiet storm. It didn't break all at once. It began with little shifts, doors left half open, glances exchanged too quickly, conversations that stopped when someone stepped into the room. In that fragile environment, trust became both the most precious resource and the most dangerous gamble. For the plantation wife, that trust was something she had built carefully with the cook over years. First, through small kindnesses, then through stories shared across the kitchen table, and finally through confessions she would never have dared utter to her husband. She trusted him not only with her meals, but with her loneliness, her shame, her dreams, and her heart. But after their secret came dangerously close to exposure, she found herself questioning every sound, every knock, every morning whisper among the enslaved women. Even the cook himself, the man she once believed she could rely on entirely, now felt like a fragile promise that could shatter in an instant. For the cook, trust was a luxury he had never been allowed. Enslaved men learned very early that trust could get you whipped, sold, or buried without so much as a wooden plank to mark your grave. But with her, he had tried. He had let himself believe in something tender, something dangerous. When she whispered that she loved him, it had filled him with equal parts ache and fear. He knew the consequences would never fall equally on them. She risked scandal, maybe exile. He risked flesh, bone, and life itself. Yet somewhere in the quiet nights, when she pressed her forehead against his and promised that she would protect him, he trusted her more than reason ever allowed. But after word began to spread, that trust trembled. He noticed how she hesitated before entering the kitchen, how her voice stuttered when she insisted everything was fine, how her hands shook when she served him bread late at night. She kept telling him she would speak to her husband, that she would find a way to keep him safe, that she would take the blame if anything happened. But he knew what white fear looked like, and hers was growing. Fear changes people. Fear makes promises thin and temporary. The enslaved people saw everything, as they always did. On plantations, they learned to read danger in the smallest expressions. They noticed how the mistress lingered too long, how her eyes followed him like a shadow refusing to detach. Some were sympathetic. They knew love could find its way into strange places, even into the cracks of cruelty where no one expected it. Others believed he was putting all of them at risk, because one man's secret with a white woman was never a private matter. If the master found out, he would not take revenge only on the cook. Punishment would wash across the quarters like fire across dry fields. One of the older enslaved women warned him. She told him that trust was a thread too thin to tie around a white woman's heart. She insisted that when the moment came, the mistress would choose safety over love, reputation over truth. He didn't want to believe her, but the seed of doubt grew. Every time the mistress cried in his arms and said she would run away with him, he wondered if she meant it, or if she was simply drowning in her own guilt. Every time she promised a future beyond the plantation, he wondered if it was fantasy or desperation. The breaking point came when the master's brother, a man known for cruelty and suspicion, announced he would be staying for several months. His presence alone was enough to unravel any delicate secret. He had an instinct for weakness, a hunter's sense for scandal. The mistress panicked. She began avoiding the cook in daylight, slipping into the kitchen only after midnight, whispering frantically that everything was going to collapse if they weren't careful. She told him to trust her, but the way her eyes darted to the windows made him feel as though she was clinging to survival rather than to him. For the cook, trust became a risk he could no longer afford. He began preparing quietly for an escape, something he had never imagined before. He spoke to a man in the quarters who knew the river routes, the hiding places, the safe paths used by runaways. He didn't tell the mistress, not because he didn't love her, but because love had turned into something that resembled a trap. Every time she said she would find a solution, he felt the walls closing in tighter. But she noticed. She noticed him pulling away in subtle, heartbreaking ways. When she reached for his hand, he no longer held it as tightly. When she whispered that she couldn't live without him, he responded with silence instead of comfort. When she asked him if he still trusted her, his eyes betrayed a truth he didn't dare speak. That truth broke her. For a woman raised with control, influence, and unquestioned authority, losing the trust of the one person she loved was a wound deeper than any scandal. Their final moments of trust cracked on a night filled with rain and dread. She begged him to stay hidden, to give her a few days to fix everything. He begged her to leave with him that very night. Both believed the other was choosing fear over love. Neither understood that both were simply choosing survival. And when dawn came, nothing was the same. The choices they made, the promises broken, the trust torn, set the tragedy in motion. It was trust that had brought them together, trust that had made their love feel possible, and the collapse of that trust that ultimately ensured the story would end not in escape, nor confession, but in death. Their love was never the poison. It was the breaking of trust, the fear underneath it, and the world that punished them for even believing trust could exist between people on opposite sides of power. Secrets can survive only as long as the people protecting them remain steady. But on a plantation, where every life is controlled, monitored, and shaped by power, nothing stays hidden forever. The truth has a way of slipping through cracks, through whispered conversations, suspicious glances, or the wrong person walking into the wrong room at the wrong time. And for the plantation wife and the slave cook, the moment their secret began to surface was not a loud explosion, but a slow unraveling that neither could stop once it began. It started with the master noticing small things, the wife leaving her room late at night, her sudden refusal to join him at dinner, the way she seemed constantly distracted, shielding her emotions as though afraid of revealing too much. She had always been calm, collected, even cold at times, but now she was a storm of nerves and trembling hands. The master observed every detail, quietly filing each oddity in the back of his mind. Men like him didn't explode immediately. They waited, listening, watching, gathering evidence in silence before striking. Meanwhile, the enslaved people sensed danger brewing. Fear spread through the quarters like smoke through dry wood. When white men became suspicious, innocent people suffered. Whispers turned into warnings. Something is coming, they said. Someone knows. Mothers pulled their children closer. Elders stayed awake longer, and every pair of eyes carried the same dread. If the mistress and the cook were exposed, the punishment would spill far beyond the two of them. The whole quarter could be whipped, locked down, or worse. The cook knew this. Every night he wrestled with guilt that his moments of stolen tenderness might bring suffering upon people who had nothing to do with it. He tried to distance himself, to appear ordinary, but his heart refused to cooperate. When she slipped into the kitchen late at night, trembling, whispering that she needed him, he couldn't send her away. But every time he held her, he felt guilt burning inside his skin like hot iron. The mistress, on the other hand, was breaking down from the inside. The fear of being discovered was crushing, but the fear of losing him was worse. She clung to him with desperation, convincing herself that if she just held on tightly enough, the world wouldn't take him away. Her need for him intensified, and that intensity became dangerous. She stopped hiding her glances, forgot to quiet her footsteps, forgot that even a breath in the wrong hallway could betray everything. And that is exactly what happened. One night, the master's brother, who had already sensed something was off, woke to the sound of footsteps crossing the back hallway. Curious and suspicious, he followed the noise, moving like a predator through shadows. When he reached the kitchen door, he didn't open it. He looked through the small crack where the wood had slightly warped from years of humidity. What he saw changed everything. The mistress, in her nightgown, standing far too close to the cook. They were not touching, not yet. But their proximity, their voices too soft, their breath too warm in the cold air, it was enough. More than enough. The brother didn't confront them. He pulled back quietly, returned to his room, and waited until morning. That was the type of man he was, a hunter who preferred to strike after his prey had grown comfortable, after the trap had closed securely around them. At dawn, he approached the master. He didn't accuse her outright. Instead, he planted seeds of suspicion, pretending concern, twisting facts just enough to ignite fear and fury. He spoke of the wife's strange behavior, her late-night movements, the cook's sudden nervousness. He didn't need to say the word affair. The master said it for him. The master, consumed by a toxic mix of humiliation and rage, decided he would watch for himself. He didn't sleep that night. He stood by his window, staring at the path that led to the kitchen. When the mistress slipped out of the house, wrapped in a shawl, hands shaking as she moved through the dark, he already knew the truth. But the moment he followed her silently and saw her inside the kitchen, standing close, whispering painfully, reaching out toward the cook, his world cracked open with an anger he had never known. It wasn't simply jealousy, it was betrayal wrapped in racism, pride, and the belief that his property had been tainted. He stepped into the doorway with a fury so violent it sucked the air from the room. The mistress froze. The cook stepped back, instinctively raising his hands in surrender, but knowing surrender meant nothing in that moment. The master said nothing at first. He just stared at them both, the woman he owned in marriage and the man he believed he owned in chains. The mistress tried to speak, but her voice collapsed. The cook did not speak at all. Any word he said could be used against him. But the master didn't need words. He had seen enough. The confrontation that followed was not loud. It was quiet, trembling, suffocating. It was the thick silence of a man deciding how he would destroy two lives at once. The mistress begged. She fell to her knees. She tried to shield the cook with her body, but the master, blinded by betrayal and fury, saw only one thing: punishment. The cook was dragged out by the master's brother and two overseers, beaten before he could catch his breath. The mistress screamed for them to stop, but her voice echoed uselessly through the night. The sound of fists hitting flesh was the only rhythm in the cold air, and as she watched the man she loved being beaten, she realized the truth. This secret had never been theirs alone. It belonged to everyone on that plantation. Every worker, every child, every elderly soul who had watched this unfold now understood that their lives would be shaped by the fallout. The cook's fate hung in the balance, and the mistress knew she had only one chance left to save him. But the master had already decided someone would die. This was the night everything changed. Trust was gone, safety was gone, and love had turned into something fatal. After the night of punishment, the plantation became a cage heavier than ever before. The mistress and the cook were no longer merely lovers in secret. They were prisoners of fear, each step carefully measured to avoid discovery, each word carefully weighed to prevent disaster. The master's wrath had left a mark, not only on the cook's body but on the fragile trust that had existed between them. Every glance now carried suspicion. Every gesture now risked exposure. What had once been tender and clandestine was now shadowed by dread, a constant awareness that any misstep could be fatal. The cook worked in silence, his body still aching from the blows he had endured. Each task, from chopping vegetables to tending the hearth, became a trial not merely of strength but of endurance. Every moment in the kitchen, he could feel the eyes of the overseers lurking nearby, ready to punish the smallest misstep. And even when alone, he was never free from the psychological weight, the knowledge that the mistress's gaze followed him, that her fear mirrored his own. In the long hours of solitude, he questioned whether they could survive the master's fury, whether the love that had once been a refuge was now a liability that would cost them everything. The mistress, meanwhile, lived in an unrelenting tension of guilt and terror. She had thought love was her secret power, a fragile rebellion that could exist in the shadows of the plantation. But now she understood the full scope of her vulnerability. Every step she took across the grand hallways, every smile she forced in the presence of her husband or his relatives, carried the weight of deception. Her nights were restless. She dreamed of the cook being dragged away, of the overseer's lashes, of the master's wrath consuming them both. She tried to hide these thoughts behind polite conversation and the routines of household management, but her inner turmoil was impossible to disguise. Her very presence radiated anxiety, a tension that everyone around her could sense. The danger escalated further when whispers began to circulate among the enslaved people in the quarters. Children mimicked the hushed tones of their elders, speaking in riddles about the mistress and the cook, and these whispers inevitably reached the ears of the overseers. In a place where information moved like fire through dry grass, even silence became suspicious. The cook and the mistress realized that their love was no longer private. It was a secret being devoured by the very people who had once been oblivious to it. Each day became a precarious balancing act, a dance where the wrong word or gesture could ignite a catastrophe. Isolation compounded their fear. The master deliberately enforced distance between them. The cook was confined to labor in the far fields during the day, under the watchful eyes of overseers who reported every movement. He could not speak to the mistress in public, and even when he did see her, their interactions were reduced to fleeting glances and whispered words that barely conveyed their emotions. The mistress, meanwhile, was trapped within the domestic sphere, constantly monitored and forbidden from approaching the kitchen during certain hours. The very spaces they had once shared in secret now became arenas of surveillance, reminders that freedom was a mirage and that danger lay in every shadow. Amid this tension, small acts of defiance became their lifelines. A hidden glance across a sunlit hallway, a brief brush of the hand under the pretense of passing an item, a whispered word through the cracks of a door. These were the only moments where their love could exist without immediate threat. Each act was a gamble, but it was also a necessity. It was a way to maintain their humanity, to assert that even under the harshest oppression, desire and loyalty could persist. Yet every act carried the knowledge that discovery could mean death, that the consequences of being caught would extend far beyond themselves to anyone who had inadvertently assisted them, even in the smallest way. The master, for his part, intensified the psychological pressure. He monitored their routines with obsessive attention, noting every change in behavior, every nervous glance, every delay in duty. He created situations designed to provoke mistakes, tasks that forced interaction between the cook and the mistress under his gaze, moments where even accidental touch could be interpreted as betrayal. In these orchestrated scenarios, he observed not only their physical compliance, but the subtle betrayals of emotion that no man of his cunning could fail to notice. It was not the punishment that terrified them most, it was the anticipation of punishment, the knowledge that every action was under scrutiny. Amid these trials, a fragile pattern emerged. The cook and the mistress began to develop a silent language of survival. Gestures, glances, and subtle expressions became their vocabulary. A tilt of the head, a momentary pause in speech, a carefully placed object could communicate volumes without revealing their secret to the master or overseers. This coded interaction allowed them to maintain connection while navigating the treacherous terrain of fear and observation. It was a testament to the resilience of human attachment under extreme duress, yet it was also a precarious web, liable to collapse at the slightest miscalculation. The emotional toll was immense. The cook suffered the dual burden of physical exhaustion from labor and the constant threat of punishment. The mistress endured the mental and emotional strain of guilt, anxiety, and desperation. Together, they lived in a state of chronic tension, where every day was a negotiation between desire and survival, love and self-preservation. Their bond, once a source of solace and intimacy, became a source of danger, an anchor dragging them both toward an uncertain fate. The stakes escalated further when the master's suspicions began to solidify into a deliberate plan of action. He no longer needed to observe silently. He had gathered enough evidence, through witnesses, patterns, and intuition, to justify his next moves. This awareness created a constant pressure, a ticking clock over their lives. Every morning became a rehearsal of caution, every conversation a test, every action a potential betrayal. The cook and the mistress were trapped in a world where their every instinct was measured against the fear of discovery, where love itself had become an instrument of vulnerability. In this environment, the very essence of their relationship was transformed. What had begun as passionate secrecy evolved into a strategic endurance of circumstance. Every touch, every glance, every word had to be calculated to ensure survival. Their love, once a source of reckless joy, became a careful negotiation, a silent testament to human resilience in the face of cruelty and oppression. Yet despite the dangers, despite the physical and psychological toll, the bond between them persisted. It persisted not only because of desire, but because the human spirit, even under the harshest conditions, seeks connection, affirmation, and the faint hope of freedom. Keynote 8 is the stage where the story pivots from punishment to endurance. The lovers' survival depends not on strength alone, but on cunning, timing, and the ability to read one another under the constant gaze of a master who relishes control. The danger is omnipresent, the psychological strain unrelenting, and yet within that peril lies the fragile, indestructible thread of human connection, a thread they must cling to, even as the plantation itself seems determined to unravel them. By the time Keynote 9 arrives, the plantation was no longer merely a setting of secrecy and subtle tension. It had transformed into a landscape of paranoia, where every shadow, every creak of floorboards, and every flicker of candlelight became a potential herald of disaster. The mistress and the cook had survived the initial exposure, endured the master's punishment, and learned the art of cautious survival, but the walls of the house had grown tighter around them. The world outside their secret had begun to intrude in ways neither could have anticipated. Whispers among the enslaved people had grown louder, curiosity had deepened among the overseers, and the master's vigilance had become relentless, almost surgical in its precision. Survival now depended not only on discretion, but on the ability to anticipate betrayal at every turn. The mistress had become a shadow of herself. The vibrancy that had once defined her presence on the plantation, her commanding posture, her eloquent speech, her laughter in the drawing rooms, had been replaced by quiet, anxious movements. She no longer walked freely through the hallways but measured her steps, ensuring she never lingered near the kitchen or other spaces where the cook might be visible to the master or overseers. Her glances were brief, furtive, and calculated, conveying urgency and affection to the cook without exposing them to prying eyes. Yet this constant vigilance came at a cost. Each moment of self-restraint drained her, and every decision carried the crushing weight of consequence. The plantation, which had once seemed a vast estate of wealth and influence, now felt like a labyrinth with invisible walls designed to trap her in fear and submission. For the cook, life had become a delicate balancing act between endurance and resistance. His days were filled with labor under oppressive conditions, and every task was performed under the invisible microscope of the master's scrutiny. Yet even in the midst of exhaustion and threat, he had learned to communicate with the mistress through subtle gestures, an intentional placement of a dish, a meaningful pause, a fleeting look. Each moment a coded reassurance of presence and loyalty. These gestures were the only lifeline of human connection, yet each carried a risk. One misstep could trigger suspicion, leading to consequences that neither could endure. He had become a master of restraint, suppressing instinctual movement, desire, and emotion in order to navigate a world where survival depended on invisibility and strategic invisibility. The master, however, had not been idle. His initial rage and physical punishment had given way to a calculated approach that combined observation, manipulation, and psychological warfare. He had learned from the early confrontations that direct confrontation could yield obedience but not insight. Instead, he constructed scenarios designed to provoke mistakes without overtly imposing punishment. He orchestrated interactions, set impossible tasks, and monitored every subtle expression for signs of guilt, affection, or rebellion. In his eyes, control was both a tool and a weapon, and he wielded it with precision. Every moment of fear he could generate in the mistress or the cook reinforced his authority and secured his dominance over both property and people. Amid these dynamics, the plantation itself became an accomplice to their peril. The sprawling fields, the isolated kitchens, the quarters filled with enslaved families, and the grand halls all contributed to the theater of surveillance and fear. Every creaking floorboard could betray a movement. Every whispered conversation could carry news faster than anyone anticipated. The very structure of the estate ensured that secrecy was a temporary illusion, and that the world of observation and judgment would inevitably encroach upon their fragile sanctuary. The lovers had to navigate this terrain with ingenuity, learning to anticipate where danger might emerge and to conceal their interactions within spaces that seemed innocuous to outsiders, yet allowed them fleeting moments of connection. It was during this time that the first whispers of rebellion and rumor began to reach the ears of the master in a way that unsettled him. Some of the enslaved people had begun to connect dots, observing interactions between the mistress and the cook, that others might dismiss as mundane or coincidental. Children, who had overheard partial conversations, mimicked words or phrases, inadvertently passing knowledge further along the quarters. Even though most were careful, fear sometimes weakened discretion, and a small slip could have catastrophic consequences. The master, ever perceptive, saw these signs as evidence that the network of secrecy was fragile, and he intensified his scrutiny. Every corner of the plantation, from the kitchen to the fields, became a space where discipline, suspicion, and fear converged. Despite the danger, the bond between the mistress and the cook persisted, but it had transformed into something far more strategic than simple passion. Every meeting, every exchange, was planned with precision to minimize risk and maximize secrecy. Their affection became encoded in gestures and glances rather than words, in small, controlled touches rather than open embraces. Love had been forced into survival tactics. Desire had been constrained by the threat of exposure. And yet, in these constraints, the intensity of their connection deepened. The impossibility of being together openly made each stolen moment more precious and more urgent, each whisper more meaningful, each glance more potent. However, survival could only delay the inevitable. The tension was reaching a point where exposure was no longer a question of if, but when. The master's vigilance, combined with the subtle betrayals and rumors circulating among the quarters, created a pressure that could not be contained indefinitely. The cook and the mistress understood this, and the anxiety of anticipation became as intense as any immediate threat. Every movement, every thought, every heartbeat carried with it the possibility of destruction. This perpetual tension shaped their actions, constraining their instincts and defining their reality. As the days passed, it became clear that Keynote 9 marked a turning point, the moment when the secret relationship was no longer merely at risk of discovery, but was actively being threatened by the convergence of observation, suspicion, and human error. Every calculated glance, every whispered word, and every gesture of care had to be considered in the context of survival. The plantation itself had become an arena of psychological warfare where each participant, master, mistress, cook, and enslaved witnesses, played roles in an unfolding drama of power, secrecy, and human emotion. In this environment, the stakes were absolute. The mistress and the cook learned that love alone could not protect them. Only strategy, caution, and the delicate maintenance of appearances could buy them the smallest measure of safety. Keynote 9 thus represents the apex of tension before the final collapse, a period where endurance, intelligence, and subtlety were tested relentlessly, and where any lapse could trigger irreversible consequences. Their bond was still intact, but it had been transformed into something fragile, shadowed by fear and danger, dependent on human calculation and the ever-watchful eye of a man who wielded authority with merciless precision. By the time Keynote 10 arrives, the story had reached its inevitable breaking point. The plantation, which had once been a vast estate of wealth, power, and rigid order, had become a crucible of fear, secrecy, and impossible choices. The mistress and the cook had survived suspicion, punishment, and the careful, watchful manipulation of the master, but their survival was precarious. Every day was measured, every step calculated, every glance and word weighed against the ever-present threat of discovery. They had learned to endure, to communicate in secret, and to navigate a treacherous world where a single misstep could result in death, but even the most careful planning could not shield them from the forces closing in around them. The master had been patient. He had observed, tested, and punished, all with the goal of consolidating power and ensuring obedience. By now, he had gathered enough evidence, through direct observation, through the testimony of the enslaved, and through the subtle betrayals that naturally occur under extreme stress, to understand the full scope of the relationship between his wife and the cook. He no longer needed guesswork or silent calculations. He had confirmation. And confirmation, in a man such as him, demanded action. The private torment, the silent punishments, the orchestrated tensions had served their purpose. The time had come for the final reckoning, the point at which the consequences of secrecy, desire, and human emotion would collide with the harsh realities of power and control on the plantation. The mistress awoke that morning in a state of dread she could not disguise. She had spent countless nights strategizing, planning contingencies, imagining escape routes, and rehearsing explanations she hoped she would never have to give. Yet even in the depth of her preparation, she could not fully anticipate the resolution that awaited. Her connection to the cook, once a source of solace and rebellion, had become the very source of danger that now suffused the estate. Every hallway, every doorway, every window carried the risk of observation. Even the smallest misstep could now trigger irrevocable consequences. Her heart pounded not merely with fear but with a deep, pervasive sense of inevitability. The cook, meanwhile, labored in the fields under the scrutiny of overseers who had become extensions of the master's own eyes. Each task was designed not only to wear him down physically, but to remind him of the precariousness of his position. The labor, already grueling in the oppressive heat and under the weight of relentless expectation, became a tool of psychological torment. He understood that the mistress's safety was intertwined with his own survival. Any deviation, any lapse, could endanger both of them. The landscape of the plantation, once a backdrop to his daily work, now felt like a vast arena of surveillance, where every step he took could signal either defiance or submission. Rumors, too, had reached the wider plantation community. Though many feared speaking openly, the undercurrent of gossip was relentless. Whispers in the quarters, among children, and between those tasked with reporting the activities of the household, began to shape perception and anticipation. The mistress and the cook understood that the plantation itself had become a living entity, responsive to the flow of information, sensitive to breaches in secrecy, and capable of amplifying even minor slips into crises of life and death. The cumulative effect of observation, rumor, and tension was that the pressure surrounding them was no longer merely psychological, it was existential. When the confrontation finally came, it was both deliberate and theatrical. The master chose the evening meal, when the household and selected neighbors were present, to assert his dominance and demonstrate control. Every detail of the setup was intentional. The placement of the guests, the timing of the cook's entrance, the deliberate positioning of the mistress to ensure her awareness of his gaze. It was a calculated display, designed not merely to punish but to humiliate, to make visible the consequences of forbidden desire in a world governed by rigid hierarchies and absolute authority. The cook, carrying trays and attempting to maintain composure, understood immediately that the moment of reckoning had arrived. The mistress, forced into the social theater of compliance, struggled to maintain an outward appearance of calm, even as her chest constricted with fear and anticipation. The confrontation unfolded slowly, as the master orchestrated exchanges designed to elicit both confession and submission. Every gesture, every word, every subtle facial expression was read as evidence of guilt. The cook, constrained by the immediate threat of violence, could not defend himself openly. The mistress, acutely aware that her reputation and her life were entwined with his, attempted to mediate through careful speech and strategic movements. Yet the master's patience and cruelty ensured that the truth emerged not as a voluntary admission, but as an imposed revelation. He forced them to acknowledge, in public and under scrutiny, the very connection that had bound them together in secret. As the evening progressed, the consequences became apparent. The cook faced a combination of physical punishment and the social marker of disgrace, while the mistress experienced a profound sense of loss and exposure. The private, passionate connection that had been their sanctuary became a spectacle of vulnerability, fear, and control. The power imbalance, long present yet previously contained, now dominated every interaction. Their attempts to protect one another, to mitigate consequences, were rendered insufficient by the master's premeditated strategy and the inexorable social and hierarchical forces that governed life on the plantation. Keynote 10 captures the culmination of all preceding events, the full revelation and its immediate aftermath. The love that had once been an act of quiet rebellion had collided with the reality of power, privilege, and systemic oppression. Survival, secrecy, and endurance, which had defined the preceding months, were no longer sufficient. The mistress and the cook were confronted with the absolute limits imposed by the plantation system, by the master's authority, and by the societal structures that defined race, class, and gender in the early 19th century. The culmination of tension, observation, and minor mistakes had created a scenario in which the consequences of desire, secrecy, and defiance could no longer be contained. In the wake of this revelation, both the mistress and the cook were irrevocably changed. Their connection, though enduring in private moments, had been forced into a context of fear, loss, and limitation. The lessons of endurance, discretion, and coded communication became intertwined with the harsh reality of punishment and social censure. Keynote 10 serves as both the conclusion of the hidden narrative and the pivot to reflection, illustrating how power, surveillance, and societal constraints can shape, distort, and ultimately punish human connection. The plantation, as both setting and instrument of control, remained the dominant force, dictating not only the boundaries of behavior but the very possibilities of survival and love. Ultimately, this keynote demonstrates that the consequences of desire in a system defined by oppression are rarely isolated. Individual actions reverberate through the social and physical structures of the estate, affecting not only the immediate participants, but also the wider network of observers, intermediaries, and witnesses. It is a moment of reckoning that blends psychological, social, and physical dimensions, leaving the characters permanently marked by the events that unfolded. Their lives, their love, and their very identities are reshaped by the collision of secrecy and power, producing a narrative of enduring human struggle within a rigid and unforgiving world. The tragic tale of the plantation wife and her forbidden love with the cook is a haunting reminder of how desire, secrecy, and power collided in 19th century America. Their story reveals the cruel realities of a society bound by strict hierarchies, where love defied boundaries but often ended in heartbreak, punishment, and irreversible consequences. From stolen moments of intimacy to the devastating exposure orchestrated by those in power, this account is a testament to resilience, human emotion, and the high cost of forbidden relationships in a world dictated by fear and control. While this story may shock and horrify, it also provides a lens into the complex dynamics of slavery, gender, and social expectation, reminding us how deeply private choices were influenced by the oppressive systems around them. The lives of the mistress and the cook are frozen in history, their love a symbol of courage, defiance, and tragedy. For modern readers, their story resonates as both a warning and a call to reflect on the consequences of unchecked power and the enduring strength of human connection. This narrative not only uncovers one of the darkest chapters of plantation life, but also highlights the timeless themes of love, betrayal, and survival. For anyone interested in historical accounts of forbidden love, power struggles, and the hidden truths of the American South, this story serves as both a gripping tale and a sobering historical lesson. Dive into this story to witness the intricate interplay of passion, secrecy, and consequence that shaped lives in ways history has rarely fully revealed.